Sometimes the letters have more than handwritten words. They bring hopes, dreams, and promises of a different life. Billy Patterson watched the dust rise up on the road that cut through his property. The midday sun mercilessly lashed the arid lands of Texas, and sweat dripped down his forehead as he adjusted his hat over his tired eyes. By the age of 42, Billy had built his farm with his own hands, stone by stone, fence by fence. He was a man of few words and much determination, but loneliness weighed on his broad shoulders like a burden that grew with each passing season. The stagecoach was slowly approaching, swaying on the time-worn wheels. Billy wiped his dirt-stained hands on his leather pants and walked toward the wooden gate he had built himself 3 winters ago. His heart was beating faster than he would like to admit. After months of exchanging letters with Katarina Miller, a 26-year-old from a distant town in Missouri, today she would finally arrive to become his wife. Katarine's letters were always delicate, written in neat handwriting and sweet words that spoke of a simple life in the countryside, of taking care of a house, and perhaps one day of children running around the yard. Billy kept each of them in a wooden box next to his bed, and on the coldest nights he read again those promises of companionship and affection. The stagecoach stopped with a creaking of the wheels on the dry land. The coachman, an elderly man with a grey beard, waved to Billy as he stepped down from the bench. Out of the vehicle came a woman in a light blue dress, but something in her movements looked different from what Billy had imagined. Katarina climbed down carefully, clutching a small leather suitcase, but her steps were uncertain, and she had to lean on the side of the stagecoach for a moment. Billy approached with hat in hand, a shy smile on his lips. Katarina was prettier than she had described in the letters, with brown hair tied in a bun and green eyes that seemed to carry a deep sadness. But there was something else. A sweet, strong smell that Billy recognized immediately. It was the same odor he smelled when he passed by the city hall on Saturday nights. Katarina smiled at him, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She held the suitcase tightly, as if it were her only anchor in a world that swayed beneath her feet. Billy noticed that her hands were shaking slightly, and when she spoke, her voice came out a little louder than necessary. The coachman handed Billy 2 larger suitcases and climbed back into his seat. With a crack of the whip, the stagecoach went on its way, leaving a cloud of dust that slowly dissipated into the hot air. Billy and Katarina stood there, 2 strangers bound together by letters and the hope of a better life. As the sun continued its relentless journey through the cloudless sky, Billy offered his arm to Katarina, who gratefully accepted it, though he felt she leaned on him more out of necessity than courtesy. They walked in silence toward the wooden house that Billy had painted white, especially for the arrival of his bride. The porch steps creaked under the weight of the two, and Billy opened the door with a gentle gesture. The house was clean and tidy, with wildflowers Billy had picked the morning before, decorating the kitchen table. Katarina looked around with eyes that seemed to have a hard time focusing on a specific spot, and Billy noticed that she was swaying slightly as she stood still. The silence stretched between them like an invisible fence. Billy had imagined this moment hundreds of times during the months of correspondence, but he had never thought it would be so. The woman in front of him was real. She was beautiful, but there was something broken about her that the letters never revealed. Katarina sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, Billy saw a tear run down her cheek, a tear she wiped quickly with the back of her hand, as if it were a secret that shouldn't be shared. The wind blew through the open windows, bringing with it the smell of dry earth and cactus flowers growing on the edge of the property. Billy remained standing, clutching his hat, watching the woman who had traveled hundreds of miles to become his wife, and realizing that perhaps they both had secrets that the letters could never reveal. The afternoon stretched out before them like an unfamiliar road, full of curves that they could not yet see. Billy knew his life had changed forever the moment Katarine stepped down from that stagecoach, but he still didn't know if that change would be a blessing or a greater challenge than any storm Texas had ever sent his way. The clock on the kitchen wall marked time with its constant ticking, and Billy wondered if Katarine heard that sound too, or if she was lost in some distant place where time had no meaning. The woman he had been waiting for so long was finally there, but it was as if a part of her was still traveling down a road that only she knew. The first few days passed like mist over the distant mountains, half real, half imaginary. Billy had woken up before dawn, as he had always done, but now there was a different presence in the house that changed even the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor. Katarina slept late, much later than any farmer Billy had ever met. When she finally went down to the kitchen, her eyes were red and swollen, and she moved with the caution of someone who feared that the world would fall apart at the slightest sudden movement. Billy would brew strong coffee and leave a cup on the table before leaving to tend to the animals. But when he returned for lunch, the cup was still full and cold. What Katarina drank was not coffee. Billy discovered this on the third day, when he found an empty bottle hidden behind the barrel of flour in the warehouse. It was whiskey, the cheapest kind you could buy in town, and Billy wondered where she got it from. His suitcases were not large enough to carry much other than clothes and a few personal belongings. During meals, Katarina barely touched the food Billy prepared carefully. She pushed the beans across the plate, cut the meat into small pieces that never reached her mouth, and responded to Billy's attempts at conversation with nods and smiles that didn't convince even herself. Billy was a patient man. He had learned patience dealing with injured animals, with the dry seasons that tested his endurance, with the land that sometimes refused to bear fruit despite all his efforts. But patience has limits, especially when it comes to the human heart. On the fourth night, Billy woke up to the sound of crying coming from the kitchen. It was a low, choked cry, as if Katarine was trying to keep her pain locked inside her chest. He walked down the wooden stairs slowly, avoiding the creaking steps, and found her sitting at the table with a half-empty bottle in front of her. Katarina did not notice his presence at first. He was looking at a yellowed letter he held between his trembling fingers, and Billy could see that the ink had smudged in places, as if old tears had fallen on the paper. The moonlight poured in through the kitchen window and created dancing shadows on Katarina's face, making her look even younger and more lost. Billy approached slowly, as he would a frightened animal, and sat down in the chair next to her. Katarina looked up, and for the first time since he had arrived, Billy saw in them something other than the mist of alcohol. He saw pure pain, the kind of pain that has no name because it is too big to fit into words. The letter in his hands was from a doctor. Billy managed to read a few lines before Katarina folded it again. "I'm sorry to inform you of the passing of your parents. Fever that spread quickly through the region. We did everything in our power." Katarina closed the letter and held it to her chest, as if it were the last connection she had with the world she knew. Billy then understood why she had traveled so far to marry a stranger, why she had left everything behind to start a new life in Texas. It wasn't just a search for love or adventure, it was escape. The silence of the night was broken only by the wind that shook the curtains and the distant sound of a coyote singing to the moon. Billy reached out slowly and touched Katarine's arm. She didn't move away, but she didn't get close either. They sat there, two human beings trying to find comfort in each other's presence, while Katarine's pain hung over them like a storm cloud. Billy didn't say anything because he knew there were no words for the kind of loss Katarina was facing. He himself had lost his parents when he was young, but not in the sudden and cruel way she had experienced. His loss had come with time, as the natural wear and tear of things, not like a bolt of lightning that destroys everything in an instant. Katarine took another sip from the bottle and offered it to Billy, who refused with a gentle shake of his head. She did not insist. She looked out the window again at the dark expanse that stretched beyond Billy's property, and he wondered if she was seeing Texas, or if she was still seeing Missouri. The house she would never visit again, the faces she would never see again. Dawn was slowly approaching, painting the horizon with soft shades of pink and gold. Billy remained by Katarine's side until she fell asleep in the chair, her head resting on her arms, folded on the table. He covered her with a blanket and went upstairs to his room, knowing that he now understood the woman who had become his responsibility. Katarina wasn't just trying to build a new life, I was trying to forget the old one. And Billy wondered if he would be able to help her on this journey, or if the ghosts she carried were too strong to be overcome by the love of a lonely Texas rancher. The sun rose once again over the Badlands, bringing with it the promise of another hot and challenging day. Billy looked out his bedroom window and saw Katarina still asleep in the kitchen, and for the first time since she had arrived, he felt something but confusion. He felt compassion, and maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something that could grow among them, even in the most arid land. Understanding changed everything and nothing at the same time. Billy woke up the next day with a new clarity about Katarina, but the situation remained as delicate as a baby bird fallen from the nest. He knew now that he needed care, not judgment. Katarina spent the next few days alternating between long periods of sleep and moments when she walked around the house like a ghost, looking for something she had lost forever. Billy began to leave small gestures of kindness scattered along her path. Wildflowers in a glass of water on the kitchen table, a clean blanket folded into the chair where she used to sit, simple but lovingly prepared food. The bottles kept appearing, but Billy stopped looking for them. Instead, he began to observe Katarina's patterns. She drank more when the afternoons were very quiet, when the wind stopped blowing, and the house was enveloped in a silence that seemed to amplify the painful thoughts. He drank less when he had some activity to occupy his hands, even if it was just folding clean clothes or organizing dishes on the shelf. Billy began to create noise. Not the kind of loud, annoying noise, but the sounds of a living house. He hummed softly while preparing meals, left the door of the workshop open so that the sound of his hammer reached the kitchen, played the old harmonica he had received from his father on the porch at the end of the day. Slowly, very slowly, Katarina began to respond to these sounds. Billy would see her sometimes standing at the kitchen window, watching him fix the fence or feed the horses. There was curiosity in her eyes, as if she was trying to understand how one could find purpose in such simple tasks. One morning, Billy found Katarina in the kitchen before he had even made coffee. She was standing in front of the stove, staring at the pots as if they were strange objects from another planet. When she saw him, she pointed to the eggs that were on the table and made a questioning gesture. Billy understood that she was asking if she could help prepare breakfast. Billy nodded and slowly began to show her how to light the wood stove, how to crack eggs without shattering the shells, how to make coffee that wouldn't be too bitter. Katarina followed his instructions with the concentration of a child learning to write, and Billy realized that she hadn't focused on anything other than her own pain for a long time. The breakfast they cooked together wasn't the best Billy had ever eaten, but it was the first Katarina had really tasted since she had arrived. She ate slowly, as if each bite was a small victory against the emptiness she carried inside her. That afternoon, while Billy was repairing the roof of the stable, he heard a sound he hadn't heard in days: Katarina singing. It was a low, melancholy song, probably something she had learned from her mother, and her voice was hoarse from disuse and sadness. But it was a human voice. It was life flowing again. Billy stopped hammering and listened. The song spoke of home, family, places where the heart could rest. When she finished, the silence that followed was not empty like the previous ones. It was full of possibilities. That night, Katarina went down to the kitchen again, but this time there was no bottle in her hands. Instead, it carried a small wooden box that Billy hadn't seen before. She sat down at the table and opened the box carefully, revealing photographs, letters, and small objects that clearly had special meaning to her. Billy joined her uninvited, but also without imposing himself. Katerine took a yellowed photograph and showed it to him. It was a middle-aged couple, standing in front of a wooden house smaller than Billy's. The man had the same green eyes as Katerine, and the woman smiled when she actually smiled. For the first time, Katerine spoke about them. His voice came out like a whisper, but they were real words, real memories. She told of how her father taught neighborhood children to read, of how her mother made the best cookies in the whole city, of how they cared about her when she decided to respond to Billy's ad in the newspaper. Billy listened to every word as if it were a rare gift. He didn't ask questions, he didn't try to offer advice, she just listened, and her silent presence told Katerina that her memories were important, that her parents had meaning, that the pain she felt was valid and understandable. When Katerine put the photographs back in the box, her hands no longer trembled. The eyes were still sad. They probably always would be to some extent, but there was something different about them. There was acceptance of Billy's presence, recognition that perhaps she was not completely alone in this vast and sometimes cruel world. That night, for the first time since she had arrived, Katerina did not cry. Billy could hear his quiet breathing through the thin walls of the house, and he himself slept better than he had in weeks. Dawn brought with it the promise of change, not the sudden, dramatic change of fairy tales, but the slow and real change of true life. Billy went downstairs to the kitchen and found Katerina already awake, preparing coffee. She looked at him, and for the first time, her smile seemed genuine. Maybe it was just the beginning. Perhaps there were still difficult days ahead. But it was a beginning, and sometimes that was all two people needed to find a way together through the loneliness of the world. The weeks that followed brought a subtle but steady transformation. Katerina began to wake up earlier, not because she had slept better, but because the silence of dawn no longer haunted her as before. Billy noticed that she began to stand on the porch in the early moments of dawn, watching as the golden light painted the distant hills. The farm began to show signs of female presence in ways that Billy hadn't anticipated. Katerina had a particular way of folding clothes that made everything more organized, and she had rearranged the pantry in a way that made more sense than the system Billy had used for years. Small changes that made the house more welcoming without her having to say a word about it. Billy discovered that Katerine knew about medicinal herbs. She'd begun to walk around the property, collecting plants that grew wild among the rocks and thorny bushes. When one of Billy's horses injured its leg in an armadillo hole, Katerina prepared a poultice that helped the animal recover faster than any medicine Billy knew about. Bottles still appeared, but less frequently. Billy noticed that Katerina drank more when she received letters from the town where she had lived, letters from people expressing belated condolences or asking questions about the belongings her parents had left behind. These letters brought back the reality of her loss in a cruel way, reminding her that there was an entire world that continued to exist without the people she loved most. One particularly warm afternoon, Billy found Katerine sitting under the only large tree on the property, an old oak tree that offered generous shade. She was sewing something, and Billy approached with curiosity. It was a simple but carefully made dress, and Billy realized it was the first time he had seen her doing anything purely productive since she had arrived. Katerina looked up when she felt his presence, and to Billy's surprise, patted the floor next to her, inviting him to sit down. They stood there in companionable silence, she sewing and he watching the clouds that moved slowly across the intense blue sky. It was at that moment that Katerina finally spoke about the future. Her voice still carried sadness, but there was a firmness in it that hadn't existed before. She said she wanted to learn how to tend to the vegetable garden, that she had noticed how Billy struggled to keep the vegetables alive in the intense heat. He said he wanted to understand animals better, especially chickens, because he had grown up in a house in the city and had never had the responsibility of caring for living creatures. Billy felt something moving inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was hope, but a careful hope, the kind that grows slowly so as not to break easily. He started talking about the farm, about his plans to expand the herd, about the possibility of planting a bigger garden if they could solve the water problem. That night, Katerina helped Billy prepare dinner for the first time. They worked side by side in the small kitchen, and Billy noticed how she moved more confidently now, as if he was beginning to consider that space as his own too. When their hands accidentally touched each other while reaching the same spice, neither of them immediately moved away. The conversation during dinner was different from the previous ones. Katerina asked questions about the history of the farm, about how Billy had chosen that piece of land, about the harsh winters and droughts that tested the endurance of any farmer. Billy responded with more words than he was used to using, finding that he had a lot more to say than he realized when there was someone genuinely interested in listening. After dinner, they sat on the porch to escape the heat that still radiated from the walls of the house. The night was clear, and the stars shone with an intensity that could only be seen far from the cities. Katerina pointed to different constellations, revealing knowledge she had learned from her father, who studied the heavens as a hobby. Billy realized in that moment that Katerina wasn't just a broken woman who had come to his doorstep seeking refuge. He was a complete person, with his own knowledge, skills, and dreams. The pain she carried was real and deep, but it wasn't all she was. As they got ready for bed, Katerina hesitated at the foot of the stairs. Billy realized she wanted to say something, but he was struggling to find the right words. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was so low that he could hardly hear. She said she was grateful that he didn't give up on her, that he had hoped that she would find her way back to life. Billy answered the only way he knew how, with simple honesty. He said he was also learning new things about himself, about patience, about how two people could help each other without trying to fix everything at once. That night, Billy fell asleep thinking that maybe the loneliness he had felt for so many years wasn't just about being alone. Maybe it was about having no one to share the little moments that made life valuable. The taste of coffee in the morning, the sound of rain on the roof, the satisfaction of a day's work well done. Katerina still had a long way to go in her healing journey, and Billy knew there would be difficult days yet to come. But something had fundamentally changed between them. They had ceased to be strangers united by correspondence and began to become two people who chose, day after day, to build something together. Texas was still unforgiving, the sun was still beating the dry land, but inside the small wooden house, something new was growing, something fragile still, but real and full of possibilities that neither of them had imagined when they exchanged those first letters months ago. Spring came to Texas with an unexpected softness that year. The rains came at the right time, filling the reservoirs and bringing new life to the pastures. Billy observed the changes in the land with the same affection with which he had observed the changes in Katerina during the previous months. The vegetable garden they had planted together began to show the first green shoots. Katerina spent her mornings tending to the plants with a dedication that Billy recognized as a genuine love for the life that was growing under her hands. She had stopped drinking completely 3 weeks ago, and Billy realized that the decision had been hers, made quietly sometime between planting the tomatoes and the first sign of rain on the horizon. One afternoon, while repairing the fence in the north pasture, Billy saw Katerina walking toward the small cemetery on the hill behind the house. It was where the former owners of the land were buried, people Billy had never met, but whose tombstones he kept clean out of respect. Katerina carried wildflowers she had gathered along the way. Billy didn't follow her, but watched from afar as she knelt between the graves and laid the flowers carefully. She stayed there for a long time, and Billy understood that he was saying his own goodbyes in his own way, even though his parents' bodies were buried hundreds of miles away. When she returned, her eyes were red, but there was not the desperate pain of the first few days. It was a different, cleaner sadness, the kind that comes when someone accepts that certain wounds will never heal completely, but they can learn to live with them. That night, Katerina asked Billy to teach her how to play the harmonica. He laughed, surprised, and said he wasn't a good teacher, but she insisted. They sat on the porch while Billy tried to show him the basic positions of his fingers and how to control his breathing. Katerina couldn't produce a recognizable melody, but the sounds coming out of the instrument were joyful and full of hope. 2 weeks later, the town's reverend visited the farm to perform the wedding ceremony that had been postponed for so long. It was a simple ceremony, held on the porch of the house, with only the reverend and a few neighbors as witnesses. Katerine wore the dress she had sewn under the oak tree, and Billy wore his best shirt, washed and ironed by careful hands. When it came time to exchange vows, Billy and Katerine looked each other in the eye and saw their own journeys reflected. They were no longer the lonely farmer and the desperate bride who corresponded through letters. They were two people who had learned to care for each other, who had discovered that true love sometimes grows not from sudden passion, but from patient compassion and daily companionship. The vows they exchanged were simple, like everything else in their lives. They promised to be there for each other, to work together for the farm that was now theirs, and to continue learning how two different people could build a shared life. After the ceremony, the neighbors left, leaving Billy and Katerina alone once again. But this time, loneliness had been transformed into intimacy, and the silence between them was no longer empty, but full of mutual understanding. That night, as they prepared to sleep as husband and wife, Katerina stopped in front of the window of the room they would now share. The moonlight illuminated the lands that stretched to the horizon, and she thought about how she had come there, looking only for a place to hide from the pain, but she had found something far more valuable. Billy joined her at the window, and together they watched the land they had grown to love and would now care for together. They had discovered that sometimes the best love stories don't begin with overwhelming passion, but with two lost people who decide to meet, slowly and carefully, like plants growing in barren soil, growing deep roots that can withstand any storm. Texas remained a harsh and unforgiving place, but inside the white-painted wooden house, Billy and Katerina had created a haven where kindness could flourish and where two wounded hearts could learn to beat in harmony again. The farm woke up the next day to a new season, with two pairs of hands to take care of the land and two hearts that had learned that true love sometimes arrives disguised as a need, but reveals itself through patience, understanding, and the courage to start over. If this story has touched your heart, don't miss the upcoming Wild West adventures we have prepared for you. Each week, we bring new narratives about courage, love, and redemption in the Badlands of Texas. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any of these exciting human journeys.